we're trying to figure out who did this, who was responsible. We're trying to figure out, who lost their lives. There's a lot of things going on that, that kind of set everything or put everything in check. And so they're, even to this day, they're still identifying and haven't positively identified everyone based on the bone fragments and things like that. But they do know, obviously, that particular people perished because obviously they did not return back home. And so they just kind of, put that and chalk that up until they knew that this particular person or these many souls lost their lives. So these punks, these terrorist punks, they got on the aircraft with box cutters, pepper spray, mace, things of that nature. And back in 2001, those were not illegal to board an aircraft. So that's why they got away with getting on board with that. So, instead of, obviously, they could have used, knives, swords, whatever. But obviously that was not allowed. And so therefore they were able to get away with that. So I remember when that happened, when especially now at home watching that first plane go into, or the first plane had already went into the North Tower. Like I said, that was what the smoke was coming out of, and I had missed. But then glued to the television pretty much all day, because we were told not to come into work that day because there were some threats on large cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, where I was, and other places. So pretty much everything was shut down. Later on, President Bush and Vice President Cheney got together, on the phone anyway, and basically ceased all travel, commercial travel within the country, and international flights coming into the United States. But like I say, watching the second aircraft go into the tower, I saw that live. I was watching a particular broadcast, and they were interviewing people, and people were saying, well, we thought it was we thought it was a Cessna, we thought it was a small commuter plane. There was just all, pretty much everything all over the place. People were, hysterical. They were in disbelief. They were in shock. So that's totally understandable. And so I remember just, continuing to watch the broadcast, and President Bush at the time was in Florida doing a fundraiser at a elementary school when he got the word. And then he made the announcement that, what happened. And he immediately said that whoever was responsible is going to pay. And that's how we first subsequently invaded Afghanistan. And that's how all that started. We started bombing many of their sites over there. Once we figured out, who was responsible, we started taking out a lot of their targets, a lot of their weapons. And in the meantime, obviously, it did kill some, maybe some innocent citizens over there, even some women and children, from what I believe, when I understand. But, that's when it comes to when you're at war and you do something like that to the most powerful nation on earth. When nothing like that we ever did, that's kind of, that's par for the course. That's what's going to happen. But I can't understand why. I mean, I know their culture is different over there, but many of those hijackers, or whatever you want to call them, they have wives and kids, right? Now they probably shared their wives with some other people over there, or they're dictators, however they live. But how do you plan to kill yourself, and just because you're going to become a hero and Allah is going to protect you, and you don't know, I mean, you're not going to know, right? You're going to die with everybody else. So you're going to do this to kill yourself, and all those other idiots over there who's sending you to do that or chose you to do that, they're still living, or they were living. But I guess that maybe if you didn't, they would probably cut your head off or something. They'd probably do something stupid to you or something like that. So I don't know. Maybe those knuckleheads didn't have a choice. But they came over here and murdered 3,000 of us, not just Americans, but 3,000 people who were on American soil. that particular day and all the chaos it caused after. Unreal. Unreal. I remember also that night. I just couldn't get it off my mind. I had been watching the news since I couldn't go to work. I literally watched the news for at least about, it seemed like 72 hours, 3 days after that happened. But on that day, I never turned away from the news because nothing else was on anyway. And so as I'm looking at the news and listening, and nightfall comes, and I'm a little tired now by now of watching it because they're kind of like rehashing the same thing, but more information is coming out. As I lay down that night, ladies and gentlemen, this is one thing I remember vividly about that night. I heard the sound of F-14s, F-16 military jets patrolling the skies in my area all night long. You would normally hear commercial, because I live 5 miles from Ontario International Airport. And so I can hear a lot of times the commercial aviation coming in and out of there, or flying over, going to LAX. But this particular night was just military jets. They were like patrolling the skies, protecting. And I'm thinking like, wow, we are really at war. And I was really scared. I'm like, I don't know what's coming next, right? All these people just died. They crashed into the 2 trade centers, the Pentagon. There was another headed to the White House or the Capitol. So what's going on now? No commercial aviation aircraft is in the sky. Nothing is allowed out. Nothing is allowed in. Military jets are circling, protecting us. Very scary time. Very, very scary time, to say indeed. United Airlines Flight 93 was headed from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco. And as I said earlier, there were 33 passengers and 7 crew. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about large commercial aviation jet liners. We're talking about 757s and 767s. 767s are considered a wide-body jet, and a 757 can be considered that too, but it's not. A 757 can carry 200 plus passengers, and a 767 is like 280, something like that. So, like I said, we're talking about 4 large jetliners, and to see the passengers in those days at 33 and 53 and 51 on such a large jet is very, very strange, because as you know, as years progressed, and because of these acts, we have to stand now 45 minutes in the TSA line, and the number of flights decreased, and so that meant there were always full flights. Because I remember the days when I can get on a 767 and, there might be 20 people, 30 people on the flight. You not only had your own seat to yourself, you had a whole 2 or 3 or 4 rows to yourself. But those days were gone after September 11, 2001 happened. So, like I say, looking at all these particular, these low numbers in passengers really kind of brought me back to saying that, wow, there was a time in space that we were there. So as Flight 93 started heading west, the passengers on board decided, or a few of them anywhere, a number of them decided that they weren't gonna take this, right? And it's a very probably the most popular of the 4 flights from September 11th was this Flight 93, because there were 2 passengers in particular. Todd Beamer, he's a 32-year-old. He was really a religious man, had a wife who was pregnant at the time. And there was another gentleman on board. His name was Mark Bingham. He was 31. He was a PR executive. And those 2 and some other passengers voted. They decided to vote to try to get into the cockpit. The punks were already inside the cockpit, and they knew that they had heard that the World Trade Center had been compromised, both towers, as well as the Pentagon. So they figured that the next target was going to be the White House or the Capitol. So, like I said, they voted and decided to rush the cockpit, and they used a food cart, a heavy food cart. And in those days, the cockpit's doors was not as sturdy as they are now. So you can hear them ramming the cockpit door with a food cart, as explained by one of the other passengers in a phone call to their loved one. Now, the family members of Todd Beamer and Mark Bingham and others listened to the tape extensively, and some family members were not convinced that they actually got into the cockpit. And then there were other family members, they were convinced that they got into the cockpit. Nevertheless, the punks inside the cockpit had already stabbed and killed the two flight officers, or the pilots, up in the cockpit, and they took over. One sat in the captain's seat and the others sat in the first officer's seat, and they commenced to try to fly the plane wherever they wanted to fly it. And as Beamer and Bingham and others were getting into the cockpit, it disrupted their plans. Now, I believe they actually got in there, because how did the plane end up crashing into a field and not into a monument? So to me, I think Beamer, Bingham, and others got into the cockpit. I think there was a struggle, and that's why, they saved a bunch of lives, even though everybody on board perished, but a bunch of lives were saved. I mean, they could have ran that into Times Square or anywhere, somewhere. They could have had their choice, but I think obviously it was thwarted. Their plans were thwarted, and everything ended in that field in Shankstown, Pennsylvania. So let's roll. That has become a phrase. That was the phrase that kind of, it pumped people up. You can hear it on the phone or the radio or the recording. It's Beamer, and they voted and they said, okay, let's do it. Let's roll. And they got that card and they did their thing. Now, I want to kind of equate that back to, and I'm not going to get off here, but it's just at that particular time when that Flight 93 was flying aimlessly, and Vice President Cheney made the decision to shoot down Flight 93, because they didn't, obviously you didn't want it to harm others. You're going to sacrifice, even if it was 250 people on board, it still would have been subject to be shot down. Not because there was only 33, because the whole thinking process is that you are trying to save others. You are trying to save people who are not in your situation. And this is what's happening today with the current situation we're into today. It's not about your choice. The government can make a choice to knock you out or to eliminate you or to push you away if, for the betterment of society and others, you are going to harm them, even if it's not your fault. So be that as it may, think about what I'm talking about. So this is the same situation for 9/11, when Vice President Dick Cheney decided that the Air Force or the Navy was going to shoot down Flight 93. It never came to that point. Like I said, Beamer and Bingham got into the cockpit, and the aircraft crashed into a remote field, and everybody on board perished. So in total on the four aircraft, 265 people were killed. At the Pentagon, 55 military personnel were killed. As well as at the Pentagon, 125 civilians were killed that day. an astounding